The morning briefing room felt colder than usual as Commander Jake Morrison spread the satellite photos across the metal table. His weathered hands traced the enemy compound's perimeter, while 20 elite Navy SEALs studied every detail. The mission seemed straightforward on paper, but Morrison knew better. 3 high-value targets were meeting in a heavily fortified mountain stronghold, protected by layers of security that would challenge even the most experienced operators. "Listen up." Morrison's voice cut through the silence. "Intelligence confirms that General Kazim, General Rashid, and General Volkov will be gathering for a strategic summit tomorrow night. These aren't just any military leaders. They're the masterminds behind the attacks that killed 200 civilians last month." Sarah Chen sat in the back row, her dark eyes absorbing every word. At 28, she was the youngest member of the unit and one of only 3 women who had ever earned a place among these legendary warriors. Her small frame often caused others to underestimate her, but her record spoke volumes. 47 successful missions without a single casualty on her team. Morrison pointed to the compound's main building. The target structure has 12 levels above ground and 3 below. Each general will have their own security detail of at least 15 men. The building is surrounded by 3 defensive rings, each manned by rotating patrols every 20 minutes. The room remained silent as the operators processed the information. This wasn't just a difficult mission. It was bordering on suicide. The compound sat on a mountaintop with only one access road, making it nearly impossible to approach undetected. Even if they managed to infiltrate, extracting alive would require a miracle. "Sir, what's our extraction plan?" asked Lieutenant Rodriguez, a veteran sniper who rarely questioned orders. Morrison's jaw tightened. "That's where it gets complicated. The nearest landing zone for helicopters is 8 miles through hostile territory. By the time we neutralize the targets, every enemy unit in a 50-mile radius will be converging on our position." Sarah shifted in her seat, her mind already working through possibilities. She had spent countless hours studying the mountain region during her free time. Fascinated by its complex cave systems and ancient smuggling routes, most intelligence reports focused on modern threats, but Sarah understood that old paths often provided new solutions. "The mission parameters are clear," Morrison continued. "We need all 3 generals eliminated simultaneously to prevent the others from escaping or activating emergency protocols. Command estimates we have a 15% chance of success." The number hung in the air like a death sentence. 15% meant that most of them wouldn't be coming home. Sarah watched her teammates' faces, seeing the same grim calculation in their eyes. They had signed up for dangerous work, but this felt like being asked to charge a machine gun nest with nothing but courage and hope. "Sir, with respect," Sarah's voice cut through the tension, "I think there might be another way." Morrison's eyes narrowed. He respected Chen's abilities, but questioning a mission briefing wasn't standard protocol. "Speak your mind, Petty Officer Chen." Sarah stood up, her compact frame somehow commanding attention from men twice her size. "I've been studying the historical maps of this region. There's an old tunnel system that dates back to the Soviet occupation. The entrances were sealed, but satellite imagery shows recent erosion that might have reopened at least 2 access points." The room erupted in whispers. Using underground routes would be incredibly risky, but it could provide the element of surprise they desperately needed. Morrison studied Sarah's face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. He found none. "Even if these tunnels exist and are accessible, you'd be going in blind with no backup. One wrong turn and you're trapped underground while the rest of the team fights a losing battle above ground." Sarah nodded. "I understand the risk, sir. But if I can access the building from below while the main team creates a distraction, I might be able to reach all 3 targets before they realize what's happening." Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, weighing impossible odds against a plan that sounded more like fantasy than military strategy. He had led men into battle for 15 years, and his gut told him this mission was a one-way ticket for everyone involved. But something in Sarah's voice gave him pause. The compound's basement levels housed their communication center and armory. He said slowly, "If you could disable their communications first, it would buy the extraction team precious minutes." The other operators began to see the potential. A solo infiltrator using forgotten tunnels could strike at the heart of the enemy's defenses while they focused on external threats. It was still incredibly dangerous, but it shifted the odds from impossible to merely suicidal. "Sir, I volunteer for the tunnel approach," Sarah said firmly. "Give me 8 hours to study the geological surveys and plan the route. I can do this." Morrison looked around the room at his team. These were warriors who had faced death countless times, but he could see the doubt in their eyes. They respected Sarah's skills, but this was asking her to accomplish what an entire platoon might struggle to achieve. Chen, you're talking about taking out 3 of the most protected men in the region, alone in unfamiliar territory with no direct support. Even if you succeed, getting out alive is another matter entirely. Sarah's expression remained calm and determined. Sir, someone has to try. These generals have been planning attacks that will kill thousands of innocent people. If there's even a chance to stop them, we have to take it. The weight of leadership pressed down on Morrison's shoulders. He had sent good people to their deaths before, but never on a mission that felt this much like sending a lamb to slaughter. Yet something about Sarah's confidence made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about impossible odds. Sarah spent the next 6 hours buried in geological surveys, satellite imagery, and historical documents that most people would find impossibly boring. The base library had become her second home as she traced water flow patterns and rock formations, looking for clues about the ancient tunnel system's current condition. Her teammates thought she was obsessed, but Sarah knew that details others overlooked often meant the difference between mission success and body bags. The Soviet-era tunnels had been carved during the 1980s by Afghan resistance fighters with help from foreign advisors. The main passage ran for nearly 2 miles underground, connecting natural caves with hand-dug corridors that were just wide enough for supply runners to navigate. Most importantly, one branch of the system ended less than 50 feet from the target compound's foundation. Commander Morrison found her still working at 300 hours, surrounded by maps and architectural plans. Chen, you need rest before tomorrow night. Sarah looked up from her notes, her eyes red from strain but still sharp with focus. Sir, I think I've found our entry point. There's a drainage tunnel that connects to the main system about 600 meters from the compound. Recent rainfall has probably cleared most of the debris. Morrison studied the hand-drawn route Sarah had mapped out. Her attention to detail was impressive, but the plan still required her to navigate underground passages that hadn't been used in decades, then somehow infiltrate a building crawling with armed guards. Walk me through it, he said, settling into the chair across from her. Sarah's finger traced the route on her map. I approach from the eastern ridge using night vision and thermal dampening gear. The entrance is hidden behind what looks like natural rockfall, but the geological survey shows it's actually loose stone covering the original tunnel mouth. She moved to a detailed floor plan of the compound. Once inside the building, I emerge through this maintenance access in the sub-basement. That puts me directly below their communication center. I disable their systems first, cutting off their ability to call for reinforcements or warn other cells. Morrison nodded slowly. Eliminating communications was standard operating procedure, but doing it from inside the building would be much more effective than trying to jam signals from outside. The general's meeting room is on the 7th floor, Sarah continued. But according to the building plans, there's a service elevator that only stops on basement levels in floors 7 through 12. It's designed for maintenance staff and VIP security, which means it won't be heavily monitored. The plan was starting to make tactical sense, but Morrison couldn't shake his concerns about the human element. Chen, you're talking about moving through a building filled with at least 60 armed hostiles. Even with communications down, someone's going to notice bodies hitting the floor. Sarah's expression grew serious. Sir, I've been thinking about that. What if we don't try to avoid detection? What if we use it? Morrison raised an eyebrow. Explain. The compound's security is designed to repel external attacks. Their response protocols assume threats will come from outside the perimeter. If I can make it look like there's an internal security breach, maybe sabotage or a traitor, it will create confusion and split their attention. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Security forces trained to watch for external threats would be thrown off balance by apparent internal problems. Guards would start looking at each other with suspicion instead of maintaining their focus on perimeter defense. How do you trigger that kind of confusion? Sarah smiled for the first time in hours. Small explosions in the wrong places. Not enough to bring down the building, but enough to make it look like someone with inside knowledge is targeting specific systems. I set charges in the generator room, the water pumps, maybe the kitchen gas lines. Nothing that endangers civilians, but enough to make their security chief think he has a serious internal problem. Morrison found himself impressed despite his reservations. Sarah wasn't just planning a military strike. She was orchestrating a psychological operation designed to turn the enemy's strengths against them. The main assault team creates external pressure starting at 2100 hours, Sarah continued. By the time you begin your approach, I should already be in position on the 7th floor. The generals will be focused on coordinating their response to what they think is a conventional attack. Morrison studied the timeline Sarah had worked out. It was complex and required split-second timing, but it addressed most of his concerns about the mission's feasibility. What about extraction? Even if you succeed in neutralizing the targets, you'll be trapped inside a building full of very angry hostiles. Sarah's smile faded slightly. That's the part I'm still working on, sir. The tunnel system might provide an escape route, but only if I can reach the basement levels before they lock down the building. They both knew the odds of Sarah fighting her way down 7 floors while enemy reinforcements poured into the building. Morrison had seen enough combat to know that even the best-laid plans rarely survived contact with reality. There might be another option, Morrison said slowly. What if the main team's assault includes a high-altitude insertion team that can reach the roof? If you can make it to the top of the building instead of trying to get back underground, we could extract you by rope. Sarah's eyes lit up. A halo jump insertion would definitely get their attention. If I time my movements to coincide with the roof assault, the confusion might give me the cover I need to reach the upper floors. They spent another hour refining the details, coordinating radio frequencies and backup signals. By dawn, they had transformed an impossible mission into merely an extremely dangerous one. The odds were still heavily against them, but for the first time Morrison began to believe they might actually succeed. As Sarah finally headed to her quarters for a few hours of rest, Morrison called after her. Chen, you know this is still a suicide mission, right? Even with the best planning in the world, too many things can go wrong. Sarah paused in the doorway. Sir, with respect, every mission is a suicide mission until we come home alive. Tomorrow night, I plan to prove that impossible just means nobody's tried hard enough yet. The helicopter dropped Sarah 12 miles from the target compound, just as the sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks. She carried minimal gear: a suppressed pistol, 3 small explosive charges, a tactical knife, and equipment for navigating underground passages. Every extra ounce would slow her down in the tight confines of the tunnel system. Moving through the rocky terrain in complete darkness, Sarah relied on memorized landmark patterns and her natural sense of direction. The approach route took her through areas where satellite surveillance couldn't penetrate, following animal paths and dry creek beds that provided natural concealment from thermal imaging systems. After 2 hours of careful movement, she reached the coordinates where the geological survey indicated the tunnel entrance should be located. What she found was a pile of rocks that looked completely natural to the untrained eye. But Sarah had studied the photos carefully and recognized subtle signs of human engineering disguised as natural erosion. Working quietly with a small pry bar, she carefully removed stones that had been carefully placed to look like random rockfall. Behind them, a dark opening just large enough for a person to crawl through disappeared into the mountain. The air that flowed from the passage was stale but breathable, carrying hints of moisture that suggested the tunnel system was still intact. Sarah activated her night vision equipment and squeezed through the opening. The passage was narrow and uncomfortable, forcing her to crawl on hands and knees for the first 100 meters. But as she progressed deeper into the mountain, the tunnel gradually widened into a space where she could move in a crouch. The tunnel showed clear signs of its military origins. Support beams carved from local timber still held firm after decades, and the floor had been leveled and reinforced with stones fitted together like an ancient roadway. Soviet engineers might have been brutal, but they built things to last. As Sarah navigated the underground maze, she checked her compass frequently and counted her steps to maintain accurate positioning. Getting lost in these tunnels would be a death sentence, and she had no way to call for help if something went wrong. The weight of total isolation pressed against her mind, but she pushed the fear aside and focused on the mission. 20 minutes into her underground journey, Sarah encountered her first major obstacle. A section of the tunnel had partially collapsed, leaving only a small gap near the ceiling that might allow passage. The alternative was backtracking and trying to find another route, which would cost precious time and might not even exist. Sarah studied the collapse carefully, testing the stability of the remaining rocks. The gap was barely 18 inches high, but it extended for about 6 feet before opening up again. She would have to remove her equipment pack and push it ahead of her while squeezing through on her belly. The passage was terrifying in its claustrophobia. Sarah felt tons of rock pressing down just inches from her back as she inched forward in complete darkness. Her breathing echoed loudly in the confined space, and for a moment she wondered if she would become permanently trapped in this underground tomb. But training and determination carried her through. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she emerged on the far side of the collapse and recovered her equipment pack. The tunnel ahead looked clear and stable, continuing toward the compound with no major obstacles visible. As she approached the compound, Sarah began to hear faint sounds filtering down through the rock, generators humming, vehicles moving, and the distant murmur of human voices. The building's foundation was directly above her, and according to her calculations, she was now less than 30 feet from her target entry point. The maintenance access point turned out to be exactly where the architectural plans indicated, but it was secured with a heavy metal grate that hadn't appeared on the building schematics. Sarah examined the fastening system and realized it could be opened from below, but only with the right tools and careful manipulation to avoid making noise. Using her tactical knife and a small multi-tool, she carefully worked at the grate's mounting points. The metal was old but well maintained, requiring patience and precision to avoid alerting anyone above. After 15 minutes of careful work, she managed to create enough clearance to squeeze through into the building's sub-basement. The basement level was dimly lit by emergency lighting and filled with the mechanical systems that kept the compound operational. Sarah moved carefully between generator units and water pumps, familiarizing herself with the layout and identifying key systems that could be targeted to create the confusion she needed. Her first priority was the communication center, located one level above according to the building plans. Sarah found a maintenance stairway that provided access between basement levels without going through main corridors where she might encounter guards or surveillance cameras. The communication room was protected by an electronic lock that would have stopped most intruders. But Sarah had trained extensively in defeating security systems. Using a small device that mimicked authorized access codes, she gained entry to the room that served as the compound's nerve center. Banks of radio equipment, satellite communication systems, and computer servers lined the walls. Sarah planted her first explosive charge among the primary communication arrays, setting a timer that would give her enough time to reach the upper floors before detonating. The explosion would cripple their ability to coordinate with outside forces or call for reinforcements. With communications compromised, Sarah began her ascent toward the 7th floor, where the 3 generals were conducting their meeting. She avoided the main elevators and stairwells, instead using service corridors and maintenance areas that were poorly monitored. As she climbed higher in the building, Sarah could hear increased activity among the security forces. Radio chatter indicated that the main assault team had begun their approach, drawing attention to the compound's perimeter defenses. The timing was perfect. Everyone's attention was focused outward while she moved freely through the building's interior. On the 5th floor, Sarah encountered her first human obstacle. A guard was conducting a routine patrol of the service areas, checking locks and ensuring that all maintenance accesses were secure. He had no reason to expect an intruder to be moving through the building from inside, but his presence still posed a significant threat to the mission. Sarah waited in the shadows until the guard passed her position, then moved silently behind him. A quick application of pressure to specific nerve points rendered him unconscious without permanent harm. She secured him in a supply closet where he wouldn't be discovered until the mission was complete. The 7th floor was now within reach, and Sarah could hear voices speaking in multiple languages as the 3 generals coordinated their response to what they believed was a conventional assault. They had no idea that their greatest threat was already inside the building, moving toward them with deadly precision and unwavering determination. Sarah reached the 7th floor just as the first explosion rocked the basement levels. The communication systems died instantly, plunging the compound into confused silence as radios went dead and satellite links failed. Through the walls, she could hear shouting in multiple languages as security forces tried to understand what was happening. The meeting room was at the end of a long corridor protected by 2 guards, stationed outside heavy wooden doors. Sarah watched from a maintenance alcove as the guards received frantic hand signals from other personnel, trying to coordinate without their communication systems. The confusion was working exactly as planned. Moving through ventilation shafts that ran along the ceiling, Sarah positioned herself directly above the meeting room. Through a metal grate, she could see 3 men in military uniforms hunched over a large table covered with maps and documents. General Kazim was pointing at defensive positions while General Rashid spoke rapidly into a dead radio. General Volkov paced near the windows, occasionally barking orders at subordinates who looked increasingly helpless. Sarah studied the room layout carefully. The 3 generals were positioned in a triangle formation around the table, with their personal bodyguards stationed near the exits. Additional security personnel moved in and out of the room carrying reports and seeking instructions. Taking out all 3 targets simultaneously would require perfect timing and flawless execution. Sound of gunfire erupted from the compound's perimeter as Morrison's assault team engaged the outer defenses. Sarah felt the building shake slightly as the defenders responded with heavy weapons, focusing all their attention on repelling the external attack. This was her moment. Using her tactical knife, Sarah carefully loosened the ventilation grate above the meeting room. She had practiced this maneuver countless times in training facilities, but never under actual combat conditions with multiple targets who could kill her instantly if anything went wrong. Sarah dropped silently from the ceiling into the meeting room, landing in a crouch behind General Volkov. Her first shot took him down before he could turn around. The suppressed weapon made almost no sound, but the general's fall alerted everyone else in the room to the presence of an intruder. General Kazim reached for his sidearm while shouting for his bodyguards. Sarah's second shot caught him center mass, dropping him beside the map table. General Rashid dove for cover behind an overturned chair, drawing his own weapon and firing wildly in Sarah's direction. The bodyguards reacted with professional speed, but they were trained to protect against external threats, not someone who had already penetrated the inner sanctum. Sarah rolled behind the heavy conference table as bullets splintered the wood around her. Her third shot, fired through a gap in the table's decorative panels, found General Rashid as he tried to reach the emergency alarm button. All 3 primary targets were down, but Sarah was now trapped in a room with 4 very angry bodyguards who had automatic weapons and years of combat experience. The element of surprise was gone, and she had to rely on superior positioning and the confusion caused by the external assault. Sarah threw her second explosive charge toward the room's main entrance, where it detonated with enough force to bring down part of the doorframe and temporarily seal the exit. The blast also shattered the windows, allowing the sounds of battle from outside to pour into the room and add to the chaos. Using the conference table as mobile cover, Sarah engaged the remaining bodyguards in a running firefight that moved through the meeting room and into the adjacent offices. Her smaller size and superior agility gave her advantages in the close-quarters combat, but she was outnumbered and running low on ammunition. The building's emergency lighting system activated as secondary explosions rocked the lower floors. Sarah's charges in the generator room had triggered a cascade failure that was systematically shutting down non-essential systems throughout the compound. The failing lights created a strobing effect that made accurate shooting nearly impossible for everyone involved. Sarah eliminated 2 more hostiles before reaching the stairwell that led to the upper floors. Her original extraction plan called for fighting her way back to the basement tunnels, but the building was now crawling with security forces searching for the source of the internal explosions. She needed a new way out, and the roof extraction that Morrison had suggested was looking more attractive by the minute. Racing up the stairwell with remaining hostiles in pursuit, Sarah could hear helicopters approaching from the east. Morrison's high-altitude insertion team was beginning their descent toward the roof, but they would need several minutes to reach the building and establish a secure landing zone. The roof access was protected by a heavy door that required both a key card and a numeric code. Sarah had neither, but she did have her remaining explosive charge. The blast that opened the door also announced her position to every enemy fighter in the building. But subtlety was no longer an option. Sarah emerged onto the roof as the first enemy helicopter appeared over the eastern ridge. The compound's defenders had finally organized an effective response, and aircraft were converging on the building from multiple directions. The extraction would have to happen fast or not at all. Morrison's voice crackled through Sarah's radio as communication systems came back online. "Chen, we have eyes on your position. Heavy resistance approaching from the south stairwell. You need to move to the northeast corner for pickup." Sarah sprinted across the rooftop as gunfire erupted from the stairwell behind her. Enemy forces were pouring onto the roof, armed with automatic weapons and desperate to prevent her escape. She dove behind an air conditioning unit as bullets sparked off the metal surfaces around her. The extraction helicopter appeared through the darkness like an avenging angel, its crew chief already preparing the rope that would carry Sarah to safety. But the aircraft was taking heavy fire from multiple positions, and the pilot was struggling to maintain a stable hover in the face of determined resistance. Sarah's ammunition was nearly exhausted, and enemy forces were advancing across the rooftop with overwhelming numbers. The mission had succeeded. All three target generals were dead and their communication systems destroyed, but her own survival was still very much in doubt as she prepared to make her final dash toward the extraction point. Sarah realized that the impossible had become merely improbable. She had accomplished what an entire military unit had deemed unfeasible, proving that determination and careful planning could overcome almost any obstacle. Now she just had to survive long enough to tell the story. The extraction rope dangled just 15 feet away, but those 15 feet might as well have been a mile with enemy fighters pouring onto the rooftop from 3 different access points. Sarah counted at least 12 hostiles advancing with military precision, using cover and coordinated fire to pin her down behind the air conditioning unit. The helicopter pilot's voice came through her earpiece, strained with urgency. "Chen, we're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. I can hold this hover for maybe 30 more seconds before we have to break off." Sarah checked her remaining ammunition. 3 rounds in her pistol and 1 fragmentary grenade. Against 12 well-armed opponents, it wasn't nearly enough for a conventional firefight. She needed something that would give her a decisive advantage in the next 30 seconds, or the mission would end with her death on this rooftop. The compound's emergency lighting was still functioning sporadically, creating areas of deep shadow between pools of harsh illumination. Sarah studied the rooftop layout, looking for any environmental factors she could exploit. Her eyes settled on a large exhaust fan housing that stood between her position and the advancing enemies. Using her tactical knife, Sarah quickly cut the straps from her equipment pack and jury-rigged a crude but effective slingshot, using the elastic material. Her fragmentary grenade became the projectile, launched not at the enemy forces but at the base of the exhaust fan housing. The explosion brought down the massive metal structure, creating a barrier that temporarily separated the advancing forces and providing Sarah with the distraction she needed. As debris rained down on the confused hostiles, she sprinted toward the extraction rope with everything she had left. Enemy muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as the scattered forces regrouped and opened fire. Sarah felt bullets whipping past her head and sparking off the rooftop surface around her feet. The helicopter was starting to drift away from the building as defensive fire intensified, making the rope harder to reach with each passing second. Sarah dove for the extraction line just as it began to swing out of reach. Her fingertips caught the rope, but her grip was tenuous and her body weight was pulling her away from the building. Below her, enemy fighters were repositioning to get clear shots at her exposed position. The helicopter crew chief began pulling Sarah up toward the aircraft, but the process was agonizingly slow under combat conditions. Enemy fire was concentrated on her position now, and several rounds came close enough that she could feel the heat of their passage. The pilot was fighting to maintain hover while taking hits to the aircraft's non-critical systems. Halfway to the helicopter, Sarah's worst fear materialized. An enemy sniper had found an elevated position and was lining up a shot that would be impossible to miss. She was completely exposed, hanging from a rope with nowhere to run and no way to fight back. The shot never came. Morrison's ground assault team had finally breached the compound's perimeter defenses and was engaging enemy forces throughout the building. Explosions echoed from below as the SEAL team systematically destroyed defensive positions and drew attention. Away from the rooftop extraction, Sarah reached the helicopter just as the pilot decided he couldn't maintain position any longer. Enemy helicopters were approaching from the south, and staying in hover over the building was becoming a suicide mission. The aircraft pulled away from the compound with Sarah barely inside the crew compartment. As they gained altitude and distance from the target, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that the impossible mission had actually succeeded. All three enemy generals were dead, their communication systems destroyed, and their summit meeting turned into a military disaster that would set back their operations for months. The helicopter raced toward the extraction zone while Sarah received medical attention for minor wounds sustained during the firefight. The crew chief checked her over professionally, but his eyes showed the kind of respect reserved for warriors who had accomplished something truly extraordinary. Morrison's voice came through the aircraft's communication system as the ground assault team reached their own extraction point. Chen, confirm mission status. Did you achieve all primary objectives? Sarah keyed her microphone, exhaustion finally starting to set in as adrenaline levels began to drop. All three targets neutralized, sir. Communication systems destroyed as planned. The summit meeting has been permanently canceled. There was a moment of silence on the radio before Morrison responded. Outstanding work, Chen. You just accomplished something that military strategists said couldn't be done. How do you feel about proving the experts wrong? Sarah looked out at the mountain landscape passing below the helicopter, thinking about the underground tunnels that had made everything possible, and the careful planning that had turned impossible odds into a successful mission. Sir, I feel like impossible is just another word for a problem that hasn't been solved yet. The return flight gave Sarah time to process what had happened over the past few hours. She had penetrated one of the most secure compounds in the region, eliminated 3 high-value targets simultaneously, and escaped from a building filled with hostile forces. The mission that military planners had given a 15% chance of success had been completed without a single friendly casualty. As they approached the base, Sarah could see that word of the mission's success had already spread. Ground crews were waiting to service the helicopter, and she could make out figures gathering near the landing pad. The impossible mission was about to become a legend, and she was going to have to figure out how to live with that kind of attention. The helicopter touched down as dawn was breaking over the mountains, ending a night that had changed everything for Sarah and her unit. Commander Morrison was waiting at the landing pad with the expression that mixed relief, pride, and something that might have been awe. As Sarah climbed out of the aircraft, Morrison approached with a smile she had never seen before. Chen, I owe you an apology. When you volunteered for this mission, I thought I was sending you to your death. I've never been happier to be wrong about something. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that Morrison carried for every person under his command. Sir, you gave me the chance to try when everyone else said it was impossible. That's all any of us can ask for. The successful mission would have far-reaching consequences for military planning and the way special operations forces approached seemingly impossible objectives. But for now, Sarah was content to be alive, victorious, and home with her team after proving that determination and careful planning could overcome any obstacle. News of the successful mission spread through military channels faster than Sarah had expected. Within hours of their return, encrypted communications were flooding in from command structures around the world, all wanting details about how a single operator had accomplished what an entire battalion might have struggled to achieve. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being debriefed by officers who outranked everyone she had ever met. Generals and admirals who normally dealt with strategic planning on a global scale were asking her to explain tunnel navigation techniques and close-quarters combat tactics. The attention was overwhelming for someone who preferred to work in the shadows. Commander Morrison sat beside Sarah during the formal debriefing, occasionally adding context about the mission planning and execution. But the senior officers were clearly more interested in understanding how Sarah had managed to neutralize 3 high-value targets in a heavily defended compound without backup or conventional support. Petty Officer Chen, said Admiral Richardson, a man whose decisions affected military operations across 3 continents. Your mission report mentions using psychological warfare to create confusion among enemy forces. Can you elaborate on how you developed this approach? Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, unused to explaining her tactical thinking to such high-ranking officials. Sir, I studied the compound's security protocols and realized they were designed to defend against external threats. By creating the appearance of internal sabotage, I was able to divide their attention and make them question their own personnel. The Admiral nodded thoughtfully. And the decision to eliminate communications first. That wasn't part of the original mission parameters, was it? Morrison answered before Sarah could respond. Sir, that modification came from Chen's analysis of the building's infrastructure. She recognized that cutting communications would prevent coordination between the targets and their support networks. General Martinez, a special operations veteran with 25 years of experience, leaned forward in his chair. Chen, I've read your service record. 47 successful missions without casualties is impressive, but this operation was in a completely different category. What made you think you could succeed where conventional planning suggested failure? Sarah considered the question carefully. These officers had the authority to reshape military doctrine based on her answers, and she wanted to give them something useful. Sir, I think conventional planning sometimes focuses too much on what can't be done, instead of looking for what might be possible. The tunnel system existed, the building plans were accurate, and the enemy's attention could be manipulated. Once I had those facts, the mission became a series of solvable problems instead of one impossible task. The debriefing continued for 3 hours, covering every aspect of the mission from initial planning to final extraction. Sarah answered questions about equipment selection, route planning, timing coordination, and combat techniques. The officers took detailed notes and asked for clarification on points that might be relevant to future operations. As the formal questioning concluded, Admiral Richardson addressed Sarah directly. Petty Officer Chen, your actions last night have demonstrated capabilities that we didn't know existed within our special operations community. Would you be interested in developing training programs based on your techniques? Sarah glanced at Morrison, who gave her an encouraging nod. Sir, I'd be honored to share what I've learned, but I hope I can continue operational assignments as well. Training is important, but there's still work to be done in the field. The Admiral smiled. I don't think you need to worry about finding challenging assignments, Chen. Word of last night's success is going to generate requests from every special operations command in the military. You may find yourself busier than you expected. After the senior officers departed, Sarah finally had a chance to decompress with her team. The other SEALs who had participated in the ground assault were eager to hear her perspective on the mission, particularly the underground infiltration that had made everything possible. Lieutenant Rodriguez, the veteran sniper who had questioned the mission's feasibility during the original briefing, approached Sarah with genuine curiosity. Chen, I've got to ask, when you were crawling through those tunnels alone, weren't you terrified that you'd get lost or trapped? Sarah thought about the claustrophobic passage through the collapsed section and the complete isolation she had felt underground. Rodriguez, I was scared the entire time. But fear is just information telling you to be careful. It doesn't mean you can't accomplish the mission. The team gathered around as Sarah described the underground journey, the building infiltration, and the rooftop extraction. Her teammates listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for combat veterans sharing war stories. But this was different. Sarah had accomplished something that redefined what they thought was possible for a single operator. Petty Officer Williams, a demolitions expert with 10 years of experience, shook his head in amazement. The way you use those explosive charges to create confusion instead of just destroying targets, that's thinking outside the box in a way that probably saved all our lives. Morrison joined the group, carrying a secure tablet with preliminary intelligence reports about the mission's impact. According to signals intelligence, the enemy organization is in complete disarray. Without their 3 senior commanders, and with their communication networks destroyed, they've lost the ability to coordinate large-scale operations. Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal accomplishment. The 3 generals they had eliminated were responsible for planning attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent civilians. Stopping them was worth every risk she had taken during the mission. Sir, what's the long-term impact likely to be? Asked Sergeant Davis, a combat engineer who had helped with the ground assault. Morrison consulted his tablet. Intelligence estimates that it will take them at least 6 months to reorganize their command structure, assuming they can find replacements with the same level of experience and authority. More importantly, other terrorist cells are going to think twice about holding high-level meetings if they know we can reach them anywhere. The psychological impact was potentially more valuable than the immediate tactical victory. Enemy organizations thrived on the belief that their leaders were untouchable in heavily defended strongholds. Sarah's successful infiltration had shattered that illusion and would force them to divert resources toward security instead of planning attacks. As the team discussion continued, Sarah noticed that her teammates were looking at her differently than they had before the mission. There was still respect and camaraderie, but also a recognition that she had accomplished something extraordinary. She had moved from being a skilled member of an elite unit to being someone who redefined the limits of what special operations could achieve. Commander Morrison pulled Sarah aside as the group began to disperse. "Chen, I want you to know that last night changed how I think about mission planning. You've proven that careful analysis and creative thinking can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable." Sarah appreciated the recognition, but she was already thinking about future challenges. "Sir, do you think there will be other missions where conventional approaches won't work? Because I'd like to keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible," Morrison smiled. "Chen, after what you accomplished last night, I think you're going to have more opportunities than you know what to do with. Every impossible mission is going to come with a note asking if Sarah Chen is available." The conversation was interrupted by a communications specialist who approached with an urgent message. "Sir, we're receiving a priority communication from Pentagon Special Operations Command. They're requesting immediate consultation with Petty Officer Chen regarding a developing situation." Sarah and Morrison exchanged glances. Less than 12 hours after completing one impossible mission, it appeared that another challenge was already presenting itself. Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and excitement as she realized that her reputation was about to open doors to assignments that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. As they walked toward the communication center, Morrison voiced what they were both thinking. "Chen, I have a feeling that last night was just the beginning. You've proven that impossible missions are just puzzles waiting for the right person to solve them." Sarah nodded, her mind already shifting into planning mode for whatever challenge awaited. The successful elimination of the 3 enemy generals had demonstrated that determination, careful analysis, and creative thinking could overcome any obstacle. Now she would have the chance to apply those lessons to new impossible missions that would test the limits of special operations capabilities. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Pentagon briefing room where it had all started, but this time she was the one presenting mission plans to a room full of skeptical military officials. The impossible had become her specialty, and commanders from every branch of service were seeking her expertise for operations that defied conventional wisdom. The latest challenge involved rescuing hostages from a floating prison ship that intelligence agencies had been unable to locate for over a year. The vessel moved constantly through international waters, protected by a sophisticated network of decoy signals and false transponders that made traditional tracking methods useless. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah addressed the assembled officers, "the key to locating this vessel isn't technology. It's understanding human behavior. Pirates need supplies, fuel, and fresh water. They also need to dispose of waste and maintain communication with their financial networks." Admiral Richardson, who had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters, nodded approvingly. "Chen, explain how we can use those requirements to our advantage." Sarah activated a digital map showing shipping lanes and commercial ports across the Pacific Ocean. "Sir, if we analyze patterns of unusual supply purchases in remote ports, combined with anomalous fuel consumption reports and irregular waste disposal, we can identify the ship's likely operating area within a 50-mile radius." The room buzzed with quiet discussions as intelligence officers realized the potential of Sarah's approach. Instead of trying to find the ship directly, they would locate it by tracking the economic footprint it left behind. General Martinez raised his hand. "Even if we can locate the vessel, boarding a moving ship in open ocean while protecting hostages presents enormous tactical challenges. How do you propose to overcome those obstacles?" Sarah smiled, remembering how Morrison had asked similar questions about the mountain compound mission. "Sir, conventional boarding operations assume the enemy knows we're coming. What if they didn't?" She switched to a detailed schematic of the target vessel type. "Intelligence reports indicate the ship has been modified with additional security measures, but it's still fundamentally a commercial cargo vessel. The hull modifications were designed to prevent external attacks, not internal problems. The parallel to her previous mission was obvious, and several officers leaned forward with interest as Sarah outlined her infiltration plan. Underwater approach using modified diving equipment allows insertion through the ship's ballast tank system. Once inside the vessel, I can disable security systems and locate the hostages before the crew realizes they've been compromised. Commander Morrison, who had been promoted following the success of the mountain compound operation, stood up to address the room. Gentlemen, 6 months ago we thought it was impossible for one person to eliminate 3 targets in a heavily defended building. Petty Officer Chen proved us wrong and saved thousands of lives in the process. The mission briefing continued for 2 hours, with Sarah answering detailed questions about timing, equipment requirements, and contingency planning. Her reputation for accomplishing impossible tasks had opened doors throughout the military hierarchy, but it had also created expectations that were sometimes overwhelming. After the formal presentation, Sarah found herself alone with Admiral Richardson, who had specifically requested a private conversation about her future career prospects. Chen, I want to discuss something with you that goes beyond individual missions, the Admiral began. Your methods have proven so effective that we're considering establishing a new special operations unit specifically designed to handle seemingly impossible scenarios. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Sir, are you talking about creating an entire unit based on unconventional approaches? The Admiral nodded. Exactly. We would recruit operators with your mindset and train them in the analytical and creative thinking techniques you've developed. The unit would handle missions that conventional forces can't accomplish. The prospect was tempting, but Sarah had concerns about institutionalizing approaches that worked precisely because they were unexpected. Sir, with respect, doesn't creating a formal unit risk making these methods predictable? Part of their effectiveness comes from enemies not expecting them. Admiral Richardson smiled. That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes you valuable, Chen. You're right that we need to maintain the element of surprise. This unit would operate with maximum operational security and focus on developing new techniques rather than repeating old ones. As their conversation continued, Sarah realized that her successful mountain compound mission had started something much larger than eliminating 3 enemy commanders. She had demonstrated that careful analysis, creative thinking, and determination could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The floating prison ship mission would be her next test, but it wouldn't be her last. Military leaders around the world were beginning to understand that impossible missions were just puzzles, waiting for the right person to solve them. Looking back at the past 6 months, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since Commander Morrison had first called the mountain compound assault impossible. She had proven that with enough preparation, analysis, and courage, even the most daunting challenges could be overcome. The briefing room was emptying as officers returned to their respective commands, but Sarah remained behind, studying the mission files for the hostage rescue operation. Tomorrow she would begin preparing for another impossible mission. But tonight she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had started as a young SEAL trying to prove herself worthy of her place among elite warriors. Now she was recognized as someone who could accomplish missions that others deemed impossible. The 3 enemy generals might have been her first major victory, but they wouldn't be her last. As Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave the Pentagon, she thought about Commander Morrison's words from that first briefing. The mission parameters are clear. We need all 3 generals eliminated simultaneously. Command estimates we have a 15% chance of success. 15% had been enough then, and it would be enough again. Sarah Chen had learned that impossible was just another word for a challenge that required a different approach. With careful planning, creative thinking, and unwavering determination, there was no mission that couldn't be accomplished. The impossible had become possible, and Sarah was just getting started.